Could it be possible? Could a lion truly remember a single human face after 10 long years? Most would scoff at the notion, calling it sentimental foolishness. But there on the wind-swept Montana plains, beneath a sky turning amber with sunset, something extraordinary unfolded that defied rational explanation. Sarah Thompson stood motionless, her weathered hands trembling slightly at her sides. The magnificent male lion approached with deliberate steps through the tall grass, his scarred face betraying years of wilderness survival. No threatening posture, no predatory stalking, just purpose. 20 yards, 10, 5. Onlookers held their breath, hands hovering over emergency radios. The lion stopped mere feet from Sarah, his amber eyes fixed on her face. Then, with gentle grace that belied his raw power, the massive creature lowered his head and pressed it against her shoulder, a gesture of recognition so intimate it brought tears to those watching. "Ranger," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as she carefully raised her hand to touch his mane. "You remembered me. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story." Sarah Thompson had not always been the fragile figure she appeared now at 65. The black and white photographs hanging in the sanctuary's main office told a different story, one of a vibrant wildlife biologist with fierce determination in her eyes and a reputation for groundbreaking research on predator behavior. Her once auburn hair, now silver white, framed a face weathered by sun and marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and profound sorrow. The Silverback Wildlife Sanctuary sprawled across 3,000 acres of Montana wilderness, nestled against the eastern slopes of the Rockies. What had begun as Sarah's family ranch had transformed under her guidance into one of the most respected wildlife rehabilitation centers in the country. The sanctuary specialized in large predators, those misunderstood creatures that found themselves increasingly at odds with human expansion. Jason Thompson, at 38, carried his mother's penetrating gaze but his father's imposing stature. His award-winning wildlife documentaries had taken him to every continent, yet he remained a stranger to the sanctuary where he had spent his childhood. The camera he perpetually carried served as both his professional tool and his emotional shield. Robert Mitchell's relationship with the sanctuary was complicated at best. Once Sarah's husband and partner in establishing Silverback, he had gradually shifted from conservationist to trophy hunter, a transformation that had torn their marriage apart 15 years earlier. Yet his financial contributions had kept the sanctuary afloat through difficult years, creating an uncomfortable dependency that Mike Harrison, the current manager, navigated with diplomatic caution. Mike had been Sarah's graduate student decades ago before becoming her most trusted colleague. His knowledge of the sanctuary's animal residents was unparalleled, particularly regarding the pride of lions that roamed the sanctuary's protected wilderness area. His careful record-keeping documented every significant event at Silverback, including the remarkable story of Ranger. Few visitors to the sanctuary knew about Emily Thompson, the bright-eyed daughter whose laughter once echoed through these hills. Fewer still understood how her death in a car accident had hollowed Sarah from within, creating a void that, against all professional wisdom, had eventually been filled by an orphaned lion cub with determined eyes and a distinctive facial scar. A lion that should never have remembered her face after all these years, yet somehow had. The forest fire of 2008 had started with a lightning strike in the northern section of the sanctuary. Despite the best efforts of local firefighters and sanctuary staff, the blaze had consumed nearly 800 acres before being contained. Sarah remembered the acrid smell that had clung to her clothes for weeks afterward as she surveyed the damage, cataloging lost habitats and displaced wildlife. "We'll need to set up temporary feeding stations along the eastern ridge," Sarah had instructed the team of volunteers. "And keep an eye out for injured animals that might have escaped the flames." Her voice had been steady, professional, the voice of the scientist she had trained herself to be, but her eyes kept drifting toward the charred remnants of what had once been a secluded grove of ponderosa pines. It was there, on the third day of assessment, that Sarah heard it, a sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind through the blackened branches, a whimper, barely audible. She paused, head tilted, listening as the sound came again. "Hello," she called softly, stepping carefully through the ash. "Is someone there?" The response was another weak cry, coming from beneath an overturned, partially burned log. Sarah dropped to her knees, heedless of the soot staining her khaki pants, and peered into the darkness. Two tiny, terrified eyes gleamed back at her. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching for her radio. "Mike, I need assistance at the North Pine Grove. I found a lion cub." The cub couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, far too young to survive on its own. Its tawny fur was singed along one side, and an angry red cut slashed above its right eye. Most concerning was the severe burn on its left front paw, which would require immediate attention. "His mother must have fled during the fire," Mike said later as they cleaned the cub's wounds at the sanctuary's medical facility. "Or worse." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "We'll need to search the area." But the search parties found no sign of an adult female lion, dead or alive. The little male cub was completely alone. "We should contact the State Wildlife Agency," Mike suggested, his voice gentle but firm. "They might want to transfer him to a specialized facility." Sarah's hand stilled on the cub's fur. "He stays here," she said, with a finality that surprised them both. "At least until he's stable." That night, Sarah slept on a cot beside the cub's enclosure, waking every few hours to check his condition. In the dim light of the medical bay, she gently stroked his head while feeding him formula from a special bottle. "You're going to be all right," she murmured. "I promise." The cub's eyes, still blue-gray and unfocused, seemed to search her face. Sarah felt a sudden piercing pain in her chest, a feeling she'd worked hard to bury 3 years earlier, after Emily's accident. On the third night, when the cub's fever finally broke, Sarah found herself reaching into her pocket for the small, stuffed animal she still carried everywhere. A tiny, well-worn plush lion that had been Emily's favorite. She called him Ranger, Sarah told the cub, her voice cracking. She said he was brave and would always protect her. The cub's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. "Ranger," she said again, and for the first time, the cub lifted his head to look directly at her. "Do you like that name, Ranger?" As if in response. The cub made a small chuffing sound. Over the following weeks, Ranger's physical recovery progressed remarkably well. The burn on his paw healed. Though it left a distinctive pattern in his fur, the cut above his eye became a scar that gave him a perpetually inquisitive expression. But more remarkable than his physical recovery was the bond that formed between the cub and Sarah. "This isn't healthy, Sarah," Robert had argued one evening, finding her asleep on the floor of Ranger's enclosure. The growing cub curled against her side. "You're treating him like a pet, like a replacement for Emily." Sarah had flinched at her daughter's name. "That's not fair," she'd replied, her voice tight. "He needs socialization. He needs to be prepared for release," Robert countered. "You're making him dependent on you. It's not right for the animal. And it's not right for you." But Sarah couldn't bring herself to maintain the professional distance her training dictated. When Ranger had nightmares, trembling in his sleep as if reliving the fire, Sarah would sit with him, humming the same lullabies she had once sung to Emily. When he became strong enough to explore the larger habitat, Sarah would spend hours watching him climb and play, documenting his progress in journals filled with observations far more detailed and personal than scientific protocol required. By 6 months, Ranger had grown into a rambunctious juvenile, still small enough for Sarah to roughhouse with, but showing signs of the powerful adult he would become. His attachment to Sarah had only deepened with time. He would follow her throughout the facility, chuffing with excitement when she appeared and becoming visibly anxious when she left for any length of time. Mike's concerns grew alongside Ranger. "The longer this continues, the harder it will be on both of you when the time comes," he warned Sarah. "I know the protocol," Sarah replied defensively. "I wrote half the rehabilitation guidelines we use." But knowing the protocol and following it were different matters. Sarah began bringing books to Ranger's enclosure, reading aloud for hours as the lion lounged beside her. She introduced scents and sounds from the wild areas of the sanctuary, carefully documenting his responses. On paper, she was following rehabilitation procedures. In reality, she was prolonging their time together. The tensions with Robert escalated as Ranger grew. Their arguments about the lion became proxies for deeper issues in their marriage. Robert's frequent absences, Sarah's emotional withdrawal after Emily's death, the different ways they had each coped with their grief. "You haven't been the same since Emily died," Robert shouted during one particularly heated exchange. "And now you're pouring everything into this animal instead of dealing with it, instead of being present in our marriage. At least, Ranger needs me." Sarah had responded coldly. "When was the last time you did?" The sanctuary staff pretended not to notice the growing strain between the couple, but everyone saw how Sarah increasingly sought solace in Ranger's company rather than her husband's. By the time Ranger reached his first birthday, he had grown into a magnificent young lion with a distinctive mane just beginning to form. His attachment to Sarah remained unwavering. When she entered his habitat, he would rush to greet her, rubbing his head against her in a gesture of affection. When she read to him, he would lie with his massive head in her lap, eyes half closed in contentment. "He'll never be releasable," Mike finally admitted one afternoon as they watched Ranger pace along the fence, waiting for Sarah to return from a supply run. "Not fully wild. Anyway." Sarah had nodded, feeling a mixture of guilt and secret relief. "We'll create a special habitat for him here, a permanent home." But Robert had other ideas, and the sanctuary board was beginning to ask difficult questions about resources being devoted to a single animal. The battle lines were being drawn, though Sarah didn't yet realize just how much she stood to lose. The oncologist's office was unnervingly quiet. the kind of silence that seems to amplify the ticking of the wall clock and the rustling of paper as Dr. Winters folded his hands over Sarah's medical file. It was January 2018, and outside the window, snow fell in lazy spirals, accumulating on the ledge. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "I'm very sorry. Sarah?" Sarah nodded, absorbing the information with the same analytical calm she'd applied to research data throughout her career. "What's the prognosis?" "Without treatment, 6 months. With aggressive treatment, perhaps a year, maybe 18 months. But I need to be clear, this isn't curable." The drive home from Bozeman to her small coastal cottage in Maine took 3 days. Sarah made the journey alone, windows down despite the winter chill, as if the cold air might somehow clear her mind. She had moved to Maine 7 years earlier, after leaving both the sanctuary and her marriage behind. The isolated cottage with its view of the Atlantic had seemed the perfect place to rebuild her life, or at least to hide from the one she'd lost. She told no one about the diagnosis for nearly a month. When Jason's call came on a Tuesday evening in February, Sarah almost didn't answer. Their relationship had been strained for years, communications limited to obligatory holiday calls and the occasional email about his latest film project. But something in her, perhaps the new awareness of limited time, made her pick up the phone. "Mom," Jason said, his voice carrying across the 3,000 miles from his apartment in Seattle. "I've been commissioned to do a series on American wildlife sanctuaries. I thought I might come visit for a few days before I start scouting locations." Sarah closed her eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter. "That would be nice," she said, meaning it more than she had expected to. Jason arrived the following week, looking older than Sarah remembered. His father's strong jawline now more pronounced beneath the carefully trimmed beard he'd grown. He moved with Robert's confidence, but watched the world with her cautious observation, a walking reminder of their shared DNA and fractured history. "The place suits you," he said, surveying the cottage with its walls of bookshelves and large windows facing the sea. "Isolated, though." "I like the quiet," Sarah replied, setting a mug of coffee before him. "How long will you be on the East Coast?" "Just a few days. Then I need to head to Montana." The name of the state hung in the air between them. Neither mentioned the sanctuary directly, but its presence filled the room like an uninvited guest. On the 3rd day of his visit, while Sarah was resting the fatigue from her first round of chemotherapy, still heavy in her limbs, Jason discovered the boxes. They were stacked in the back of her office closet, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. Curiosity overrode discretion, and he carefully cut the tape on the top box. Inside were dozens of journals, their covers worn from handling. Jason opened one at random, his eyes widening as he read the neat, precise handwriting, April 18, 2009. Ranger attempted his first real roar today. He seemed as startled by the sound as I was, backing up a few steps before trying again with more confidence. His scar gives him a perpetually surprised expression that contrasts with the growing majesty of his bearing. He's going to be magnificent. Jason moved to the window seat, journal in hand, and continued reading. By the time Sarah woke and found him, he had gone through 3 of the journals. "You had no right," Sarah said, her voice tight as she stood in the doorway. Jason closed the journal carefully. You wrote about him like he was your child. He was my patient, Sarah corrected, but the words lacked conviction. These aren't clinical observations. Mom, you were reading him Hemingway. You were sleeping in his enclosure. I don't need to explain myself to you, Sarah interrupted, moving forward to take the journal from his hands. You weren't there. Because you sent me away, Jason replied, a flash of old hurt crossing his face. After Emily died, you sent me to boarding school. And then when I finally came home for good, you were completely absorbed with this lion. And then you left entirely. Sarah sank onto the window seat beside him, suddenly exhausted. It wasn't that simple. Then explain it to me, Jason said. Because Dad never would. All he ever said was that you chose the sanctuary over your family. Sarah stared out at the gray winter ocean. Your father gave me an ultimatum. The sanctuary or our marriage. Because of Ranger. Partly. Sarah sighed. He said I was using Ranger to avoid dealing with losing Emily. He wasn't entirely wrong. Jason was quiet for a long moment. What happened to Ranger after you left? Sarah's hands tightened on the journal. I don't know. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unasked questions. Why did you really leave the sanctuary, Mom, after everything you'd built there? Sarah looked down at her hands, thinner now, the veins more prominent since her treatment began. Robert was on the board. After our divorce, he leveraged his financial contributions to push for policy changes. The sanctuary was shifting focus from rehabilitation to tourism and trophy hunting under controlled conditions. Dad would never. He marketed it as conservation hunting, Sarah continued, claiming that allowing wealthy donors to hunt select animals would fund the protection of others. When they approved the new direction, I couldn't stay. And Ranger? Sarah's eyes closed briefly. Robert assured me he would be protected. He was one of the sanctuary's star attractions by then. Jason studied his mother's face, seeing the doubt that lingered there, even after 7 years. You don't believe that, do you? I don't know what to believe anymore, Sarah admitted. I've spent years trying not to think about it. They sat in silence as the light faded outside the window, the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore marking the passage of time. Finally, Jason asked the question that had been building since he found the journals. Do you ever regret leaving? Every day, Sarah whispered. The next morning, Sarah found Jason at the kitchen table, his laptop open, scrolling through images of the Silverback Wildlife Sanctuary website. They still have your conservation research prominently featured, he noted as she poured herself tea. Though the hunting experiences are advertised too, just more discreetly. Sarah glanced at the screen, then away. I'm surprised they still reference my work at all. Mike Harrison is listed as the director now, Jason continued. And there's a whole section dedicated to their lion conservation program. Sarah's hand stilled on her mug. Is there any mention of no specific lions are named? Jason said, answering her unfinished question. But there are several photos of a male with a distinctive facial scar. Sarah set down her tea, moving to look over Jason's shoulder. There, On the screen was a powerful lion with a familiar mark above his right eye, standing atop a rocky outcropping. "That's him," she breathed. "That's Ranger." Jason looked up at his mother's face, seeing the complex emotions playing across it. "I need to film at several sanctuaries for this series," he said carefully. "Silverback should be included." Sarah stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't go back there." "Mom," Jason said, closing his laptop. "There's something you haven't told me." "Isn't there?" Sarah moved to the window, watching the winter waves crash against the shore. "I have cancer," she said finally, her back still turned to him. "Stage 4, pancreatic. Terminal." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only when Jason's chair scraped back as he stood. "How long?" he asked, his voice tight. "A year, maybe less now that treatment has started." Jason crossed the room to stand beside her, both of them looking out at the unforgiving ocean. "All the more reason to go," he said softly, "before you can't any more." Sarah turned to face her son, seeing in his eyes a determination that mirrored her own at his age. "It would be painful," she said. "Seeing what's become of it. Seeing Robert." "Maybe," Jason acknowledged. "But isn't there also something you need to see for yourself? Someone—" Sarah's gaze drifted to the photo she kept on her mantel, a younger version of herself with Emily on her lap, both smiling into the camera. Next to it stood a smaller frame, one Jason had never paid much attention to before. It showed Sarah sitting under a tree, reading a book, while a half-grown lion rested his head in her lap. "I've spent 7 years wondering if he's alive," Sarah admitted. "If he's being treated well, if he remembers." "Then let's find out," Jason said, reaching for his mother's hand. "Let's go see Ranger." The Montana landscape unfurled beneath them as the small chartered plane began its descent toward Bozeman. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching familiar mountains emerge from the morning mist. 10 years had softened their edges in her memory, but their rugged majesty remained unchanged, a testament to permanence in a world where everything else seemed to shift and fade. "You okay?" Jason asked, reaching across to touch her arm. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The chemotherapy had left her weaker than she'd admitted to Jason, and the prospect of returning to Silverback filled her with a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread. What would remain of the place she had built? What would remain of her legacy, or of Ranger? "Mike's sending someone to meet us," Jason said, checking his phone as they taxied toward the small terminal. "He apologized for not coming himself. Apparently there's some situation with a new mountain lion they've rescued." "That's Mike?" Sarah said with a faint smile. "Always prioritizing the animals." The sanctuary driver was a young woman Sarah didn't recognize, who introduced herself as Amber. "It's such an honor to meet you, Dr. Thompson," she gushed as she loaded their luggage into the SUV. "Your research on predator rehabilitation is required reading for all our interns. I wrote my master's thesis on your work with socialized predators." Sarah managed a polite smile, though the mention of her research sent a pang through her chest. "How long have you been at Silverback?" 3 years now. I started as an intern and just never left. It gets under your skin. You know." Sarah knew all too well. The drive from Bozeman to the sanctuary took just over an hour, winding through landscapes that grew increasingly familiar. When they crested the final hill and the main gates of Silverback came into view, Sarah felt her breath catch. The modest wooden entrance, she remembered, had been replaced by an imposing stone archway with a sleek visitor center attached. A large sign proclaimed Silverback Wildlife Sanctuary Conservation Through Experience. "We get almost 100,000 visitors annually now," Amber explained proudly as they pulled into a designated parking area. "The interactive exhibits have been especially popular with school groups." Sarah nodded silently, taking in the changes. Where once there had been a simple gravel lot and a converted ranch house serving as offices, now stood a complex of modern buildings with architectural angles that mimicked the surrounding mountains. Walkways lined with interpretive signs led visitors toward various exhibits. "Mom," Jason said quietly, noticing her expression. "You okay?" Before she could answer, a familiar figure emerged from the main building. Mike Harrison had aged well in the decade since Sarah had seen him last. His hair had gone completely silver, and new lines framed his eyes, but he moved with the same purposeful stride she remembered. When he spotted their vehicle, his face broke into a wide smile. "Sarah," he called, hurrying toward them as they stepped out of the SUV. "My God, it's really you." The embrace was awkward at first, too many years and too many unspoken words between them, but then Mike tightened his hold, and Sarah found herself leaning into the familiar comfort of an old friend. "You look good, Mike," she said as they separated. A flicker of concern crossed his face as he studied her. "You look terrible," she finished with a wry smile. "Cancer will do that." Mike's expression sobered. "Jason mentioned you were ill. I'm so sorry, Sarah." "Don't be," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "I didn't come here for sympathy. I came to see what's become of my sanctuary." Mike gestured toward the complex. "Let me give you the tour, then. A lot has changed, but I think you'll be pleased with much of our progress." As they walked, Mike explained the sanctuary's evolution. The educational programs had expanded dramatically. Research partnerships with 3 universities had been established. A state-of-the-art veterinary facility now occupied what had once been Sarah's modest medical building. "And the hunting program?" Sarah asked as they passed a luxurious lodge clearly designed for wealthy visitors. Mike's step faltered slightly. "It's controlled, limited, and the funds do support our conservation efforts. Robert's idea, I assume he is our primary benefactor," Mike acknowledged, a note of discomfort in his voice. "After you left, the board was in a difficult position financially." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the twist of betrayal she felt. They continued past enclosures housing various predators, wolves, mountain lions, bears, all designed to provide natural environments while allowing visitor viewing. "And the lions?" she finally asked, the question she'd been holding back since their arrival. Mike's pace slowed. "We maintain a pride of 8 lions in our largest habitat area. It's nearly 800 acres of enclosed wilderness at the north end of the property. And is one of them—" Sarah couldn't quite finish the question. "Ranger is still with us," Mike confirmed, his voice softening. "He's 12 now, getting older, but still healthy." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, relief washing through her. "I'd like to see him." "The lion habitat is closed to visitors today," Mike said, a little too quickly. "Maintenance issues with the viewing platforms." Jason, who had been filming discreetly throughout their tour, lowered his camera. "But surely you could make an exception for my mother, given her history with the sanctuary." Something flickered across Mike's face. Hesitation, perhaps, or worry. "It's not that simple. The pride dynamics are complex. Ranger isn't always visible even when the viewing areas are open." "Mike," Sarah said, laying a hand on his arm, "what aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, a deep voice called from the direction of the main building. "I thought that was you." Sarah turned, her spine stiffening as Robert Mitchell approached. Time had weathered him differently than Mike hardened rather than softened his features. His hair was still thick but now steel gray, and he carried himself with the confident authority of a man accustomed to deference. The hunting rifle slung casually over his shoulder seemed more a statement than a tool. "Hello, Robert," Sarah said, her voice cool. "Sarah." He nodded, then turned to Jason. "Son, good to see you." Jason's jaw tightened, but he returned the nod. "Dad." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group before Robert broke it with a forced chuckle. "Well, this is quite the family reunion. What brings you back after all this time? Sarah Mike mentioned you were visiting, but not why." "Jason is filming a documentary on wildlife sanctuaries," Sarah replied. "I decided to accompany him." Robert's gaze swept over her, taking in her diminished frame and the headscarf that covered her hair loss. "You're unwell." It wasn't a question. But Sarah answered anyway. "Terminal cancer. I'm making peace with various parts of my life." Something like genuine regret flickered in Robert's eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Mike was just about to show us the lion habitat," Jason interjected. "Mom wants to see Ranger." Robert and Mike exchanged a quick glance that Sarah didn't miss. "Is there a problem with that?" she asked. "Not at all," Robert said smoothly. "But as Mike probably mentioned, the viewing platforms are under repair. Safety concerns. Perhaps tomorrow would be better." Sarah studied her ex-husband's face, recognizing the careful neutrality that had always masked his more complicated emotions. "What's going on? Robert is Ranger, all right." "He's fine," Robert assured her. "Just getting older, like all of us." "Then I'd like to see him today?" Sarah insisted. "We don't need the viewing platforms. I know my way around this sanctuary better than anyone." Another glance passed between the men, laden with unspoken communication. Finally, Mike sighed. "Let's continue this conversation in my office. Shall we? There are some things you should know before you visit the lion habitat." Mike's office occupied what had once been Sarah's workspace in the original ranch house, now renovated and incorporated into the larger administrative complex. Sarah noted with a mixture of surprise and gratitude that many of her personal touches remained the topographical map of the sanctuary she had painstakingly created. The framed photographs of successful rehabilitations, even the ancient leather armchair where she had spent countless nights reviewing case notes. "You kept it all," she murmured, running her fingers along the edge of her old desk. "It seemed wrong to change too much," Mike replied, closing the door behind them. "This was always your space in my mind." Robert remained standing by the window, his posture rigid. Let's not get sentimental. Sarah wanted to know about Ranger. So tell her. Mike sighed, gesturing for Sarah and Jason to sit. Ranger is complicated. After you left, Sarah, he became increasingly difficult to manage. He refused to integrate with other lions. He became agitated around most staff members. He was looking for you, Robert interjected, pacing the boundaries of his enclosure, calling out. It was disturbing the visitors and the other animals. Sarah felt a painful tightening in her chest. You didn't tell me this when I left. What would you have done? Robert challenged. Come back. Chosen him over our marriage. Oh, wait, you already had. That's not fair, Sarah began. But Mike raised a hand to interrupt the brewing argument. The point is, Ranger presented unique challenges. He continued. The board, including Robert, decided he should be released into the larger reserve area rather than kept in the display enclosures. He's been living primarily wild for the past 7 years, with minimal human contact. Sarah leaned forward. But you've been monitoring him. Mike hesitated. Yes and no. We track all the lions generally, but Ranger, he's become something of a special project for me. I've been documenting his movements more closely than officially required. Why would that be necessary? Jason asked, his filmmaker's instinct sensing a story beneath the surface. Mike and Robert exchanged another glance, this one tense. Because, Robert finally said, the board has been considering designating him as a candidate for the conservation hunting program. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt as though she'd been struck. You want to let someone hunt Ranger, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's aging, Robert said, his tone maddeningly reasonable. He's not breeding with the females. He's essentially taking resources without contributing to the conservation program. And a lion with his distinctive markings would command a premium donation enough to support 10 other lions for years. You son of a bitch, Sarah breathed. You promised me he would be protected. That was 7 years ago, Robert countered. Circumstances change. Sanctuaries need funding. When? Sarah demanded, turning to Mike. When is this supposed to happen? Mike wouldn't meet her eyes. The board votes next month. Nothing's decided yet. Sarah stood abruptly, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness hit her. Jason reached out to steady her, but she waved him away. I want to see him. Today. Now. Sarah, be reasonable. Robert began. You're in no condition to... I'm dying? Robert. She cut him off, her voice sharp. I have perhaps months left. If you or anyone else tries to stop me from seeing Ranger one last time, I promise I will spend every remaining day making sure the world knows exactly what kind of conservation happens at Silverback. The threat hung in the air, its weight amplified by the quiet conviction in Sarah's voice. Robert's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. I'll take you, Mike said finally. But Sarah, you need to understand he's not the same lion you knew. He's been living wild for years. He may not... He hesitated. May not remember me, Sarah finished. That's a chance I'll have to take. As they prepared to leave, Sarah paused at the door. One more thing, she said, turning back to Robert. If anything happens to Ranger, if that hunting proposal moves forward in any way, Jason has my journals. Every detail of how this sanctuary was founded, funded, and operated, every ethical compromise, Every corner cut. I've kept meticulous records, as you both know. I'm sure the wildlife conservation community would find them fascinating reading. Robert's face darkened. Is that a threat? Consider it my dying wish. Sarah replied evenly. Ranger lives out his natural life, undisturbed. Are we clear? After a tense moment, Robert gave a curt nod. Crystal. Outside the office, Sarah sagged against the wall, the confrontation having drained what little energy she had. Jason hovered nearby, concern evident in his expression. Are you sure about this? Mom, we could come back tomorrow when you're rested. Sarah straightened, determination overriding fatigue. I need to see him, Jason, while I still can. As they headed toward Mike's Jeep, Sarah noticed a weathered structure in the distance, partially hidden by newer buildings but unmistakable to her eyes. Ranger's original enclosure, the place where she had spent countless hours nursing him, teaching him, loving him, stood like a ghost from her past, untouched amid all the changes. You kept it, she said to Mike as they approached the vehicle. Mike followed her gaze and nodded. Some things shouldn't be erased, no matter how much others might want them to be. The silent acknowledgement of his small rebellion against Robert's reshaping of the sanctuary passed between them, a fragile thread reconnecting their old alliance. Sarah's heart lightened just slightly as they drove away from the main complex toward the wild heart of Silverback, where somewhere among the trees and rocks, Ranger made his solitary home. The northern section of the sanctuary remained largely as Sarah remembered it, wild, untamed, a landscape of rolling grasslands punctuated by rocky outcroppings and stands of pine. As Mike drove the Jeep along a rough service road, Sarah pressed her palm against the window, as if trying to reach through the glass to touch the land she had once known intimately. The Pride usually ranges within about 500 acres, Mike explained, steering around a deep rut in the road. They prefer the eastern ridge during summer, but this time of year, they're more likely to be near the old waterfall basin, where I used to read to Ranger, Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the others. Mike glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. You remember? I remember everything, Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Jason, in the back seat with his camera, captured the exchange silently. He had been filming throughout their journey, documenting his mother's return with the practiced detachment of a professional. But beneath the camera's shield, he was struggling to reconcile the sanctuary's reality with the childhood memories he had carefully preserved. Memories of a place where animals were protected, not hunted, where his mother had seemed most alive, where his family had once been whole. The viewing platforms are about half a mile ahead, Mike continued, but as I mentioned, they're closed for repairs. We can park at the maintenance access point and proceed on foot to the ridge overlook. It gives a good view of the basin, though I can't promise Ranger will be visible. He tends to keep to himself more than the other lions. How many are in the Pride now? Sarah asked. 8 total, 1 dominant male, not Ranger, 3 females, and 4 subadults from last year's cubs. Ranger maintains a solitary territory that overlaps with the Pride's range, but he rarely interacts with them directly. He was never properly socialized with other lions, Sarah noted, a hint of regret in her voice. That's my fault. I kept him too close. You saved his life, Mike corrected gently. Everything after that was just complicated. The Jeep rounded a bend, and Mike slowed to a stop beside a small utility shed. "We'll walk from here. It's about a quarter mile to the overlook." Sarah nodded, steeling herself for the exertion. She had been honest with Jason and Mike about her diagnosis, but had downplayed the toll the treatments had taken on her strength. Now, facing even this modest hike, she wondered if she had overestimated her stamina. "I can carry some gear," Jason offered, noticing her hesitation. "I don't need coddling," Sarah replied, more sharply than she intended. Then, softening, "But thank you. I'd appreciate if you'd carry the water." They set out along a narrow trail that wound through tall grasses already beginning to turn golden in the late summer heat. Dark clouds gathered on the distant horizon, promising an afternoon storm typical for this time of year in Montana. The air felt heavy with approaching rain, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage that Sarah had missed without realizing it. "The weather's turning," Mike observed, glancing at the sky. "We should keep this visit brief." Sarah nodded but said nothing. Conserving her energy for the walk, each step seemed to require more effort than the last, her body betraying her determination. By the time they reached a rocky promontory overlooking a small valley, she was breathing heavily, her face pale beneath the wide-brimmed hat she wore for protection from the sun. "Here," Mike said, indicating a flat boulder that offered a natural seat. "This gives the best view of the basin." Sarah sank onto the stone gratefully, her legs trembling with fatigue. Below them stretched a peaceful scene, a meandering creek lined with cottonwoods, patches of tall grass swaying in the gathering breeze, and the weathered remnants of what had once been a natural rock formation augmented to create a lion habitat. From this distance, the valley appeared empty of life, though Sarah knew appearances could be deceiving in the wild. "They're often most active near dusk," Mike said, handing her a pair of binoculars. "But sometimes we get lucky." Sarah accepted the binoculars but let them rest in her lap, her gaze sweeping the landscape without artificial enhancement. This place held too many memories to view through a lens, memories of tracking lessons with a half-grown ranger, of reading Hemingway aloud while sprawled in the shade of the cottonwoods, of the afternoon she had first allowed him to explore the water, his initial cautious paw dips giving way to playful splashing. "This was his favorite place," she said softly. "He would lie in the sun on that flat rock by the creek for hours, just watching the water." Mike nodded. "He still does. Some habits remain, I guess, even after all these years." A comfortable silence fell between them as they scanned the valley. Jason moved a short distance away, capturing footage of the landscape and occasionally turning the camera toward his mother's profile, recording her expressions as she reconnected with this piece of her past. The minutes stretched into a half hour, then longer. The threatening storm clouds advanced, casting shifting shadows across the basin. A few raindrops began to spatter against the rocks around them, but Sarah showed no inclination to leave. "Mom," Jason finally said, "maybe we should head back. We can try again tomorrow." Sarah shook her head without looking away from the valley. "Just a little longer." Mike checked his watch, concern evident in his furrowed brow. "The storm's moving in faster than I expected. It's not safe to be exposed on this ridge if lightning starts." "5 more minutes," Sarah insisted, her voice soft but unyielding. "Please." Perhaps it was the pleas that silenced their objections, a small concession to vulnerability from a woman who had spent her life projecting strength. Whatever the reason, both men fell silent, respecting her request despite their growing unease as the weather deteriorated. 4 minutes passed in tense silence. The wind picked up, bending the tall grasses in waves across the basin. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "Sarah," Mike began, his tone gentle but firm. "We really need to—" "There," she interrupted, suddenly straightening. "By the eastern tree line. Do you see—" Mike raised his own binoculars, scanning the area she indicated. "I don't—" "Wait." He adjusted his focus. "Yes. There's something moving there." Jason swung his camera toward the tree line, zooming in to capture whatever had caught their attention. Through his viewfinder, he saw it, a tawny shape moving with fluid grace along the edge of the forest. "Is it him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. Mike continued to study the animal through his binoculars. "Hard to tell from this distance. It's definitely a male lion, but—" "It's him," Sarah said with absolute certainty. She stood, swaying slightly, her eyes never leaving the distant figure. "I need to go down there." "Absolutely not," Mike responded immediately. "It's not safe. Sarah, the storm, the terrain, not to mention approaching a wild lion. Even if it is Ranger, he hasn't had close human contact in years." "I didn't ask for your permission, Mike," Sarah replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm going down. You can come with me or stay here, but I am going to see him." Jason stepped forward, placing a hand on his mother's arm. "Mom, think about this. You can barely make the walk back to the Jeep, let alone down into that basin and back up." "Then I won't come back up," she said simply. The matter-of-fact declaration stunned both men into momentary silence. "What are you saying?" Jason finally asked. Sarah turned to face her son fully, her expression softening. "I'm dying, Jason. Whether it happens in a hospital bed in Maine or here in this place that I love, what difference does it really make?" "All the difference in the world," Jason protested. "You can't just—" "I need to see him," Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "Once more, up close. I need to know if he remembers. Can you understand that—" Before Jason could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A black SUV was making its way along the service road toward their position. "Robert," Mike said grimly. "He must have followed us." Sarah's expression hardened. "All the more reason to go now. I won't let him stop me." Without waiting for further discussion, she began making her way down a narrow game trail that led toward the basin. Each step was careful, deliberate, her hand occasionally reaching out to steady herself against rocks or tree trunks. The first heavy raindrops began to fall in earnest, quickly soaking through her light jacket. "Sarah," Mike called after her. "This is madness." She didn't turn back, her focus entirely on navigating the descent. After a moment's hesitation, Jason shouldered his camera equipment and followed, unwilling to let his mother make this journey alone. Mike watched them go, torn between responsibility for their safety and respect for Sarah's determination, before finally hurrying after them. The descent took nearly 20 minutes, far longer than it would have in Sarah's healthier days. By the time they reached the basin floor, all three were soaked through, and Sarah was visibly exhausted, her breathing labored. The lion they had spotted was nowhere to be seen. "He must have sensed the storm and sought shelter," Mike suggested, scanning the tree line. Sarah shook her head. "He's here. I know it." She began walking toward the creek, where a large, flat rock jutted out over the water, the same rock she had mentioned earlier as Ranger's favorite resting place. Behind them, they could hear a vehicle door slam, followed by Robert's voice calling from the ridge. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get back up here before this storm breaks fully." Sarah ignored him, continuing her determined progress toward the creek. When she reached the flat rock, she stopped, running her hand over its rain-slick surface. Then, with careful movements, she lowered herself to sit upon it, facing the tree line where the lion had disappeared. "Ranger," she called, her voice carrying across the basin despite the increasing rainfall. "It's me. It's Sarah." Jason stood a few yards back, his camera raised despite the rain, unwilling to miss documenting whatever might unfold. Mike positioned himself between Sarah and the trees, his hand resting near the tranquilizer gun he carried as a precaution. "Sarah," Robert's voice came again, closer now, as he made his own way down the trail. "This is insanity. There's a storm coming, and you're calling for a wild lion." Sarah turned her head slightly toward his voice but didn't respond. Her attention focused on the tree line. "Ranger," she called again. I came back for you." A flash of lightning illuminated the basin, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. In that brief electric moment, something moved at the edge of the trees, a tawny shape, larger than memory had painted it, stepping cautiously into the open. "Oh my God," Mike breathed, his hand tightening on the tranquilizer gun. The lion paused, rain darkening his magnificent mane as he surveyed the strange tableau before him, 3 humans standing in his territory during a gathering storm. His eyes, amber and piercing, seemed to look past Mike and Jason, fixing instead on the small figure seated on the flat rock. "It's him," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's really him." The distinctive scar above the lion's right eye was visible even through the rain, a permanent reminder of the fire that had brought him into Sarah's life 12 years earlier. He stood motionless, water streaming down his powerful frame, his gaze unwavering. Robert emerged from the trail, stopping abruptly when he saw the scene before him. Unlike Mike, he carried an actual rifle, which he instinctively raised toward the lion. "Don't you dare!" Sarah called out, her voice suddenly strong despite her physical weakness. "Put it down, Robert, now." "Did." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, Sarah on the rock, Ranger at the tree line, Robert with his rifle half raised, Mike and Jason frozen between. Another lightning flash illuminated them all in stark relief. Nature's spotlight on a drama 12 years in the making. In that electric moment, Ranger took a step forward, then another. His movements were cautious but purposeful, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Stay very still," Mike murmured, though the warning was unnecessary. No one dared move as the massive predator continued his careful approach. Time seemed suspended as Ranger advanced, his massive paws silent despite the rocky terrain. Rain cascaded down his tawny coat, darkening his mane to a deep russet that framed his scarred face. Each deliberate step brought him closer to Sarah, who remained motionless on the flat rock, her breathing shallow but steady. "Sarah," Robert hissed, his rifle still half raised. "Don't move. Mike, get the tranquilizer ready." "No," Sarah replied without taking her eyes from the approaching lion. "No tranquilizers, no rifles. Lower your weapon. Robert, have you lost your mind? That's a wild predator." "That's Ranger," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite her physical weakness. "And if you shoot him, I swear I will never forgive you. Not in this life or whatever comes after." Something in her tone, perhaps the raw conviction or the mention of mortality, made Robert hesitate. His rifle remained at the ready, but he didn't move to aim it as Ranger continued his approach. Jason stood transfixed, his camera capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. Through his viewfinder, he observed details his naked eye might have missed: the slight tremor in his mother's hands as she braced herself on the rock, the intense focus in Ranger's amber eyes, the white-knuckled tension in his father's grip on the rifle. Ranger was now less than 15 feet away. He paused, nostrils flaring as he scented the air, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. A low rumble emanated from his chest, not quite a growl, but a sound of questioning, of uncertainty. "It's me," Sarah said softly, extending one trembling hand, palm up. "I've come back, just like I promised." The lion's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He took another step forward, then another, until he stood directly before her, close enough that Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his massive body, could see the individual droplets of rain clinging to his whiskers. "Mom," Jason whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Be careful." Sarah didn't acknowledge her son's warning. She remained focused entirely on Ranger, her extended hand unwavering despite her weakness. "Do you remember?" she asked the lion. "Do you remember when I found you? When I read to you under that tree over there? When I had to say goodbye?" Ranger lowered his head slightly, bringing his face level with hers. His breath, warm and wild, mingled with the cool rain between them. For several heartbeats, they simply regarded one another, woman and lion, once inseparable, now reunited after a decade of separation. Then, with a gentleness that belied his wild nature, Ranger stepped closer and pressed his massive head against Sarah's outstretched hand. A small, broken sound escaped Sarah's lips, half laugh, half sob. "You do remember," she whispered, her fingers curling into his mane. "You remember me." Behind them, Robert slowly lowered his rifle, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief and reluctant wonder. Mike's hand dropped from the tranquilizer gun, and Jason found himself lowering his camera, unwilling to intrude on the intimacy of the moment even for the sake of documentation. The tableau held for several precious seconds, Sarah seated on the rock, her hand buried in Ranger's mane, the lion's head pressed against her in a gesture of recognition that defied explanation. Then, with the same deliberate grace that had marked his approach, Ranger shifted position until his head rested against Sarah's shoulder, much as he had done as a cub seeking comfort all those years ago. Sarah's free arm came up to encircle his neck, her face pressing into his rain-soaked mane. "I missed you," she murmured, words meant only for the lion. "Every day. I missed you. The storm which had been building throughout their encounter, chose that moment to unleash its full fury. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The sudden violence of the storm startled Ranger, who pulled back from Sarah with a jerk. "It's okay," she soothed, trying to maintain contact. "It's just thunder." But the spell had been broken. Ranger backed away several steps, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert. Behind him, at the edge of the tree line, movement caught their attention, several tawny forms appearing from the shelter of the forest. "The rest of the Pride," Mike explained quietly. "They're seeking higher ground before the basin floods." Ranger turned his head toward the other lions, then back to Sarah, seemingly torn between two worlds. Sarah straightened on her rock, visibly summoning her remaining strength. "Go," she told him gently. "It's all right. I found what I came for." As if understanding her words, Ranger held her gaze for one final moment before turning and loping toward the other lions. They accepted his approach without aggression, and together, the Pride began moving toward higher terrain as the rain continued to pour down in sheets. "We need to do the same," Mike urged, stepping forward to help Sarah. "This basin can flood quickly during summer storms." Sarah nodded, but as she attempted to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. The emotional intensity of the encounter, combined with her physical weakness from the cancer treatments, had depleted her last reserves of strength. She collapsed back onto the rock, pale and shaking. "Mom!" Jason rushed to her side, supporting her as she struggled to remain upright. "I'm okay," she insisted, though her labored breathing belied her words. "Just need a minute." Robert approached cautiously, his rifle now slung across his back. "We don't have a minute. Sarah, this place will be underwater in 20 minutes if this rain keeps up." Without waiting for her response, he moved to her other side. "Jason, take her left arm." "I've got her right." Together, they helped Sarah to her feet, but it was immediately clear she couldn't walk unassisted. After a brief, wordless exchange, Robert handed his rifle to Mike and swept Sarah into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he had once carried her across the threshold of their first home. "Put me down," Sarah protested weakly. "I can walk." "You can't, and we both know it," Robert replied, already beginning the ascent toward the ridge where they had left the vehicles. "For once in your life, Sarah, let someone help you." The climb back up the ridge was arduous, made more treacherous by the increasingly muddy trail and the steady rainfall. Robert carried Sarah with grim determination, his jaw set against the exertion. Jason followed close behind, ready to assist if his father faltered, while Mike took the lead, occasionally reaching back to provide support on the steeper sections. Halfway up, Sarah's head lolled against Robert's shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed. "Sarah!" Robert's voice sharpened with alarm. "Sarah, stay with me." Her eyes opened with visible effort. "I'm just tired. Robert, so tired." "I know, but you need to stay awake until we get you to a doctor." The gruffness of his tone couldn't quite mask his concern. "No doctors," Sarah murmured. "Not anymore. I told you. I'm done with treatments." "Mom, please," Jason interjected from behind them. "At least let them make you comfortable." Sarah didn't respond, her eyes drifting closed again despite Robert's attempts to keep her engaged. By the time they reached the vehicles, she was semi-conscious, her breathing shallow and her skin alarmingly pale. "We need to get her to the hospital in Bozeman," Mike said, already opening the door of his Jeep. Robert shook his head. "My SUV is faster, and I know a shortcut." He carefully placed Sarah in the back seat, then turned to Jason. "Ride with her. Keep her talking if you can." Jason nodded, climbing in beside his mother and gently lifting her head onto his lap. "What about you?" he asked Mike. "I'll follow in the Jeep." Mike replied, "Go. I'll call ahead to the hospital." The drive back was a blur of rain-slicked roads and tense silence, broken only by Jason's quiet encouragement as he tried to keep his mother conscious. In the front seat, Robert drove with single-minded focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Stay with us, Sarah," he murmured, his words almost a prayer. "Not like this. Not yet." But Sarah seemed to be drifting further away with each passing mile. Her eyes, when they opened at all, were unfocused, and her responses to Jason's questions became increasingly incoherent. By the time they reached the outskirts of Bozeman, she had fallen into a state of unconsciousness that no amount of gentle shaking could disrupt. The emergency room staff were waiting when they arrived. Alerted by Mike's call, they whisked Sarah away on a gurney, leaving Robert, Jason, and Mike, who had arrived minutes after them, standing in the sterile waiting room, soaked through and shell-shocked by the rapid turn of events. Family for Sarah Thompson. A doctor appeared after what seemed an eternity but was likely less than an hour. "I'm her son." Jason stepped forward. "And this is my father, her ex-husband." The doctor's expression was grave. "Your mother is in critical condition. The combination of her advanced cancer, the physical exertion, and exposure to the elements has caused significant stress to her already compromised system. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her, but I need to be honest with you, the prognosis isn't good." Jason nodded, having expected nothing less. "Can we see her? She's not conscious at the moment. But yes, you can sit with her, 2 at a time, please." As Jason and Robert followed the doctor down the corridor, Mike called after them. "I'll contact the sanctuary, let them know what's happened." Robert paused, turning back. "Tell them—" He hesitated, then continued with newfound resolve. "Tell them the board meeting about Ranger is canceled, permanently. He's to be left alone for the rest of his natural life." Mike's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded. "I'll make sure of it." The hospital room was dimly lit, the steady beep of monitors providing a rhythmic backdrop to Sarah's labored breathing. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her fierce spirit somehow diminished by the clinical surroundings and the tubes connecting her to various machines. Jason took the chair on one side of the bed, while Robert, after a moment's hesitation, settled on the other. Neither spoke. The weight of the situation and their complicated shared history rendering words inadequate. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if nature itself was protesting the imminent loss of one who had devoted her life to protecting its wildest creatures. Dawn broke over Bozeman with the tentative beauty that follows a violent storm, pale light filtering through dissipating clouds, the air washed clean and carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. In Sarah's hospital room, this new day arrived unheralded. the blinds drawn against both darkness and light. Time marked only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the shift changes of medical staff. Jason had dozed off in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, his camera equipment piled neatly in the corner, untouched since their arrival. Robert stood by the window, having pulled the blinds aside just enough to observe the emerging day. The night had passed in a strange truce between father and son, their usual tensions suspended in the gravity of Sarah's condition. "Mr. Thompson," a nurse spoke softly from the doorway. "Dr. Winters would like to speak with you both." Robert nodded, turning from the window to gently shake Jason awake. "The doctor's here," he murmured. Jason straightened, rubbing his face to clear the fog of insufficient sleep. Dr. Winters, a woman in her 50s with prematurely silver hair and kind eyes, entered the room carrying Sarah's chart. "How is she?" Jason asked immediately. Dr. Winters glanced at Sarah's still form before addressing them. "She's stabilized, which is something of a miracle given her condition upon arrival. However, I need to be very clear with you both, this is temporary. The cancer has progressed significantly, and yesterday's physical stress accelerated the decline." "How long?" Robert's question was blunt, his voice rough from a night without sleep. "Days," Dr. Winters replied gently. "Perhaps a week at most. I understand from her medical records that she had discontinued treatment." Jason nodded. "She decided against further chemotherapy about a month ago, said she wanted quality over quantity." "A choice many make in her situation," the doctor acknowledged. "Given that decision, I would recommend focusing on comfort measures rather than interventions. If she regains consciousness, and I believe she might, you should use that time for whatever conversations remain important." Robert turned back toward the window, his shoulders rigid. "Can she be moved?" Dr. Winters frowned slightly. "Moved? I wouldn't recommend transferring her to another facility in her condition." "Not to another hospital," Robert clarified. "To the sanctuary. To her home." The question hung in the air, unexpected and complex. Dr. Winters considered it with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that medical recommendations sometimes needed to accommodate deeper human needs. "It would be against conventional medical advice," she finally said. "But if you're asking whether it would significantly shorten what little time she has left, probably not. She would need proper palliative care set up there, portable oxygen, pain management protocols." "We'll arrange everything," Robert said with sudden decisiveness. "Jason, don't you think your mother would rather spend her last days at Silverback than in this room?" Jason studied his father's face, searching for hidden motives but finding only genuine concern. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "She would, but why the change of heart? Dad, yesterday you could barely stand to be at the sanctuary." Robert's gaze shifted to Sarah's unconscious form. "Yesterday I watched a wild lion recognize your mother after 10 years of separation. I watched him choose gentleness over fear." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "I've spent 7 years telling myself I was right to give her that ultimatum to make her choose between the sanctuary and our marriage, but seeing her with Ranger, I realized I never really understood what she built there, what she created." Dr. Winters cleared her throat softly. "I'll consult with her oncologist about arrangements for home hospice care." "If you're serious about this, we should move quickly." "We are," Jason confirmed. still watching his father with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "Thank you, Doctor." After Dr. Winters departed, a heavy silence fell between father and son. Finally, Jason broke it. "You really mean it? Taking her back to Silverback?" Robert nodded, his expression solemn. "I owe her that much. More than that, really. But it's all I can offer now." Before Jason could respond, a faint voice interjected from the bed. "You could always offer to carry my books." They both turned sharply to find Sarah's eyes open, though heavy-lidded with exhaustion. A ghost of her familiar wry smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Sarah." Robert moved quickly to her bedside. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough," she murmured. "Did I hear correctly? You want to take me back to the sanctuary?" "If that's what you want," he confirmed. Sarah's gaze shifted between the two men. "What I want," she said slowly, each word requiring visible effort, "is to see Ranger again. Properly this time, not in a storm, not with rifles and fear." Her eyes fixed on Robert. "Can you give me that?" It was a test. Perhaps the final one in their long, complicated relationship. Robert held her gaze steadily. "Yes," he said simply. "I can give you that." A single tear tracked down Sarah's weathered cheek. "Then take me home. Robert, take me back to Silverback." The preparations moved with surprising speed, accelerated by Robert's influence and Mike's tireless coordination at the sanctuary. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had been transferred by medical helicopter to Silverback, where the old ranch house had been hastily converted into a hospice space under the supervision of a local palliative care team. "This isn't exactly how I imagined coming back," Sarah remarked as Jason helped adjust her position in the hospital bed that now occupied what had once been her living room. Through the large windows, she could see the sanctuary grounds extending toward the distant mountains, golden in the late afternoon sun. "Are you comfortable?" Jason asked, arranging pillows behind her back. "As comfortable as a dying woman can be," Sarah replied with the directness that had always characterized her approach to life. "Don't look so stricken, Jason. We both know why I'm here." "Still," he began, but she shook her head, cutting him off. "No regrets," she insisted. "Not now. Tell me instead what's happening with Ranger." Jason hesitated, unsure how much to share, but the determined look in his mother's eyes convinced him honesty was the only approach she would accept. "Dad and Mike are trying to arrange things. They've been tracking Ranger's movement since we left yesterday. The Pride has returned to their usual territory after the storm." Sarah nodded, conserving her limited energy. "And Robert, he's really agreed to this?" "More than agreed," Jason said, still sounding slightly bemused by the development. "It was his idea to bring you back here, and he's been on the phone since dawn, calling board members to formally cancel any consideration of the hunting program, not just for Ranger, but altogether." A complicated expression crossed Sarah's face. Surprise mingled with something like vindication, perhaps even a reluctant softening toward her ex-husband. Before she could respond, the door opened to admit Mike and Robert. "The medical team is all set up in the guest cabin," Mike reported. "They'll check on you every 2 hours, with someone stationed outside at all times." "And Ranger?" Sarah asked immediately. The men exchanged glances before Robert stepped forward. "We've located him. He's at the eastern edge of the Pride's territory, near that rock formation you used to call the Sentinel." "I remember," Sarah said, a faint smile touching her lips. That was always one of his favorite places to watch the sunset. "We've arranged for a specialized transport," Robert continued. "A modified open jeep with medical supports. If you feel strong enough, we can take you there at dusk. The Pride is usually most settled then." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise evident in her expression. "You're really going to do this?" Robert met her gaze directly. "I promised, didn't I?" For a moment, something of their old connection flickered between them, an understanding that transcended the bitterness of their separation. Then Sarah nodded, her decision made. "Dusk. Then I'll rest until then." As the men turned to leave, Sarah called after Robert. "Why?" she asked simply. "After everything, why now?" Robert paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Because I was wrong," he said, without turning around. "Not about everything, but about what mattered most to you. I thought it was just the sanctuary, or just Ranger. But it was something larger, something I didn't understand until yesterday." He glanced back at her finally. "Get some rest, Sarah. I'll come for you at dusk." The hours until sunset passed in a strange limbo for Sarah, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, past and present blurring at the edges. In her more lucid moments, she gazed out the window at the sanctuary, her sanctuary, and felt a profound sense of completion. Whatever mistakes she had made, whatever regrets still lingered, she had created something lasting here, something that mattered. When Robert returned, accompanied by a nurse and the specialized transport team, Sarah was ready. The effort of being transferred to the modified jeep left her breathless and pale, but her eyes remained clear and determined. "You don't have to do this," Robert said quietly as they secured her medical supports. "Just say the word and we'll take you back inside." "I'm going," Sarah replied firmly. "I need to see him one more time." The journey to the Sentinel rock formation took nearly 40 minutes, traveling slowly over terrain that had to be navigated with extreme care to avoid jostling Sarah unnecessarily. Jason followed in a second vehicle with Mike, his camera equipment ready to document what all of them tacitly understood might be Sarah's final journey. As they approached the formation, the setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, casting long shadows across the grasslands. The nurse monitored Sarah's vital signs constantly, concern evident in her furrowed brow. But Sarah herself seemed energized by the expedition, her gaze eagerly scanning the horizon. "There," Mike's voice came through the radio. "At the base of the formation. Do you see him?" Robert slowed the vehicle to a stop, keeping a respectful distance from where a solitary figure rested at the foot of the towering rocks. Even from 100 yards away, there was no mistaking Ranger's distinctive silhouette, the powerful body, the full mane, the watchful posture. "He's alone," Mike noted, surprise evident in his tone. "The rest of the Pride must be hunting elsewhere." "It's perfect," Sarah whispered, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Can we get closer?" Robert glanced at the nurse, who reluctantly nodded. "Her vitals are holding, just a little closer, though." With painstaking care, Robert eased the vehicle forward until they were perhaps 50 yards from the lion. Ranger had noticed their approach, his head raised and ears alert, but he made no move to retreat. "This is close enough," Robert decided, cutting the engine. "Any nearer might spook him." Sarah didn't protest, her attention fixed entirely on the magnificent creature before them. For several minutes, they simply observed in silence as Ranger watched them in return, the mutual assessment unfolding in the golden light of sunset. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, Ranger began to move, not away from them, as might be expected of a wild animal confronted with human presence, but toward them the same deliberate approach he had made during the storm, but now unhurried, almost dignified in the fading light. "He's coming to her," Jason murmured from the second vehicle, his camera capturing the extraordinary moment. "Again, he's recognizing her again." Robert tensed slightly, one hand moving toward the tranquilizer gun Mike had insisted they bring. "Sarah?" "No," she said firmly, reaching out to stay his hand. "Let him come. I'm not afraid." Ranger continued his approach, his pace steady and purposeful, until he stood perhaps 20 feet from the vehicle. There he paused, as if awaiting some sign or permission. "Hello, old friend," Sarah called softly, her voice carrying in the still evening air. "I came back, just like I promised, one last time." At the sound of her voice, Ranger's ears pricked forward. He took another step, then another, until he stood directly beside the open vehicle, close enough that Sarah could have reached out to touch him, had she the strength. For a long moment, lion and woman regarded each other, their connection transcending the barriers of species, time, and circumstance. Then Ranger did something that left even Mike, who had devoted his life to studying these animals, speechless. He circled to the back of the vehicle where Sarah's hospital bed had been secured and, with careful deliberation, lay down beside it, pressing his massive body against the metal frame as if to share his warmth and strength. Sarah's hand, trembling with weakness, moved to rest on the edge of the bed nearest him. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to Ranger, to Robert, or to some larger force orchestrating this impossible reunion, none could say for certain. As the sun slipped below the horizon, casting its final golden rays across the sanctuary, Sarah Thompson's expression held something that had been absent for far too long: peace. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate Sarah's final journey. Against all medical expectations, she rallied somewhat after the encounter with Ranger, gaining enough strength to sit up in bed and spend hours gazing out the window at her beloved sanctuary. "It's the mountain air," she insisted when the hospice nurse expressed surprise at her improved alertness. "Always did me more good than any medicine." Robert and Jason established an unspoken rotation, ensuring that one of them was always with her while the other handled the necessary arrangements and communications with the outside world. To everyone's surprise, it was Robert who seemed most reluctant to leave her side, often spending entire nights in the chair beside her bed, dozing fitfully between her medication schedules. "You don't have to stay," Sarah told him on the third night, her voice soft in the darkness. "I know that chair is murder on your back." "My back's been through worse," he replied, adjusting his position slightly. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I missed too much before. I don't want to miss this." The simple honesty of his statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgment of past failures and present reconciliation that required no further elaboration. More remarkable than Robert's vigil was Ranger's. After that first evening at the Sentinel, the Lion had followed their vehicle back to the ranch house, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly trailing their procession. Since then, he had taken up residence beneath Sarah's window, leaving only briefly to hunt before returning to his self-appointed post. "It's unprecedented behavior," Mike explained to the sanctuary staff, who had been instructed to maintain their distance, but were understandably fascinated by the situation. "In all my years studying lions, I've never seen anything like it. He's essentially abandoned the pride's territory to be here." For Sarah, Ranger's presence became a source of immeasurable comfort. Each morning she would ask to be positioned near the window so she could observe him. Sometimes she would talk to him softly, sharing memories or observations that needed no response. Other times they would simply exist together in companionable silence, separated by glass but connected by something deeper than physical proximity. On the fifth day, when her strength permitted, Jason helped her out onto the covered porch where a hospital bed had been arranged to allow her to be closer to both the sanctuary and Ranger. The Lion approached cautiously, under Mike's watchful supervision, and settled at the foot of the porch steps, his massive head resting on his paws as he gazed up at Sarah. "I've been thinking about Emily," Sarah said unexpectedly, her voice just strong enough for Jason to hear as he sat beside her. About what she would make of all this. Jason glanced at his mother, surprised by the mention of his sister. In the years following Emily's death, Sarah had rarely spoken her name aloud. "What do you think she'd say?" he asked gently. A smile touched Sarah's lips. She'd love it. The drama of it all. She always did have a flair for the theatrical. She paused, her gaze drifting to Ranger. "You know, she was the one who first suggested we convert the ranch into a sanctuary, just 10 years old, and already she had it all figured out." "I didn't know that," Jason admitted. "There's a lot you don't know," Sarah replied, a note of regret coloring her voice. "I should have shared more with you. After we lost her, I just couldn't find the words." "You're sharing now," Jason said, covering her hand with his own. "That counts for something." On the 7th day, Robert received a call that pulled him reluctantly away from the ranch house. When he returned several hours later, his expression was grim but determined. "The board was challenging my decision to end the hunting program," he explained to Jason while Sarah slept, "claiming I overstepped my authority with a unilateral decision." A tight smile crossed his face. "So I bought them out." Jason stared at his father. "What do you mean?" "Bought them out." "I mean I leveraged every asset I have and purchased controlling interest in the sanctuary," Robert replied matter-of-factly. "The hunting program is officially terminated, and the sanctuary's mission statement has been amended to explicitly prohibit any such activities in the future." "Does Mom know?" Jason asked, glancing toward the bedroom door. Robert shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to make sure it was finalized before I told her." He hesitated, then added, "I'm also establishing a research endowment in her name for the study of emotional bonds between humans and predator species." The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Robert had seemed to stand for over the past decade, that Jason found himself momentarily speechless. Finally, he managed to ask the question that had been building since their arrival at the sanctuary. "Why now, Dad?" After all these years of fighting her on everything related to Silverback, why this complete reversal? Robert's gaze drifted toward the window, where Ranger could be seen maintaining his vigil. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought her connection to Ranger was unnatural, unhealthy, a replacement for what we lost with Emily." He shook his head slowly. "But seeing them together again after all this time, I finally understood what she's been trying to tell me for years. Some bonds transcend our understanding. That doesn't make them wrong." On the morning of the 9th day, Sarah woke with unusual clarity, requesting to be taken outside one more time. The day was perfect, crisp autumn air, clear blue sky, the aspens beginning to turn golden along the ridgelines. Robert and Jason settled her carefully on the porch, wrapping her in blankets against the morning chill. "It's a good day," she remarked, her gaze sweeping across the sanctuary grounds. "A good day for endings." Neither man challenged her assessment. They had both seen the subtle changes over the past 24 hours, the increasing difficulty breathing, the longer periods of sleep, the way her gaze sometimes seemed to focus on something beyond their vision. Ranger approached the porch as he had each day, but this time he didn't stop at the steps. With careful deliberation, he climbed onto the porch itself and settled beside Sarah's bed, close enough that she could reach out with trembling fingers to touch his mane. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to Ranger or to the men who had made this final reunion possible remained unclear. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, Sarah occasionally drifting into sleep only to wake with a start, as if afraid to miss a moment of her final day. During one such period of wakefulness, she beckoned Robert closer. "Promise me something," she said, her voice barely audible. "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Take care of him." Her gaze shifted meaningfully toward Ranger. "Let him live out his days in peace." "I promise," Robert said solemnly. "The sanctuary is secure, Sarah. No hunting, no exploitation. I've made sure of it." A faint smile touched her lips. "You finally understand." "Too late," he acknowledged, regret heavy in his voice. "Not too late," she corrected gently. "Just in time." As the afternoon waned, Sarah's breathing became more labored. The hospice nurse hovered nearby, adjusting medication to ensure her comfort. But there was an unspoken understanding among all present that the end was approaching. "Jason," Sarah called softly as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. "Bring your camera. I want you to record something." Jason complied, though filming felt intrusive in this most intimate of moments. "What do you want me to record?" "Mom, everything," she replied simply. "The sanctuary, the sunset, Ranger." Her gaze, still remarkably clear despite her weakness, met his directly. "Some things should be remembered." As the golden light of sunset bathed the porch, Sarah Thompson took her final breaths, her hand resting in Ranger's mane, surrounded by the wild beauty she had devoted her life to protecting. Robert held her other hand, while Jason captured the extraordinary tableau woman, lion, and landscape united in a moment of perfect peace. When the end came, it was gentle, a quiet exhalation, followed by stillness. Ranger raised his massive head, a low rumble emanating from deep in his chest, not quite a roar, not quite a purr, but something uniquely his own. A farewell, Sarah and Ranger's story reminds us that the connections we forge in this life transcend our understanding and sometimes even defy explanation. For those of us who've reached the age where we've loved and lost, where we've made choices we sometimes regret, and where we feel the weight of time's passage in our bones, this story speaks to our deepest truths. It tells us it's never too late to return to what matters most. Never too late to reconcile. Never too late to acknowledge we were wrong. The bond between this remarkable woman and the lion who remembered her after 10 long years shows us that love, in its purest form, doesn't fade with time or distance. As we face our own sunsets, isn't this what we hope for? That the love we've given returns to comfort us? That our life's work continues beyond our final breath? That those we've hurt might